open borders, shameful abandonment, disregard for human life, the prospect of more mandates and lockdowns, and the list goes on. Now more than ever, we need to stick together. Voting alone is not enough. We must use our dollars to support like-minded companies that fight for our rights and beliefs. Patriot Mobile is America's only Christian conservative wireless provider who shares your values. Last year, we gave more than $500,000 to conservative causes. With your support, we'll give more than $1.5 million this year. It's time to band together and support companies that truly love America and fight for our freedoms. Will you join us?
This is Kentucky's Voice Radio, covering the latest state and local issues with Tom Fallbush, Bob Scott, and Jim Waters.
Good morning, Kentuckiana. You're listening to Kentucky's Voice, likely on 970 AM in the Louisville area. We want to go through all of the different options, however, for how you can see and or hear the podcast this morning. If you have access to Facebook or YouTube, we do a live stream on both. You can find those by searching for Kentucky's Voice. Just search for that live stream on Facebook or go to YouTube and you can click on the live tab for Kentucky's Voice and see this streaming. We also do a television rebroadcast of this program each weekday. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. There's a different host for most of those days, and you can catch those on WBNA. That's channel 21 on Spectrum, and we usually rebroadcast those at 12:30, 4 p.m., and 8 p.m. So if you want to catch that on TV, you can watch one of those rebroadcasts on most of those days. We also have the ability to text in. Producer, can you give me that number again for our text line? It's 502-571-0970. So if you want to text in during the show, we'll try to get to it. I'm probably our worst host in terms of trying to integrate those into the show. But nevertheless, we do read your comments, and even if we don't comment or read them on the show, we do get the message that you're trying to send to us. Also, if you would be willing to donate to the show, we are listener supported. This is one of the only options that we have for local news and Kentucky specific news in the Louisville area. And if you want to hear that conservative voice, we would appreciate your support. You can you can donate by going to our website, and that is kyvoice.org. kyvoice.org. There will be links to a lot of the different platforms for how you can find our show. But on the top, there's also a button that says donate. Please click on that, and you will be able to, set up a monthly donation or do a one-time donation to try to support our support conservative opinion in the Louisville area. A couple of business announcements. This week, we are actually going to have interviews on air of Daniel Cameron tomorrow with Jim maybe it's Jim Waters. I'm not actually sure who the host is going to be, but Daniel Cameron will be interviewed. That's tomorrow. We will have Andy Barr, I believe, on Thursday of this week, and then Nate Morris next Wednesday. So if you are as interested in that U.S. Senate race as I am, or if you want to become more informed about what I consider one of the top two elections in this election cycle, we will have one-on-one interviews with very similar questions for all of the candidates, and you can get their opinion on some hot-button issues in the conservative movement. Some other announcements. This Thursday, the Louisville Tea Party has their monthly meeting. We will have several local candidates and Metro Council members. I think we have 4 Metro Council members or Metro Council candidates. I think we have a state rep that is going to speak briefly, and we're reaching out to 1 or 2 other people that will be on the ballot. These are for local races. So if you want to go to that Louisville Tea Party meeting, that is at Roosters in Middletown. That's 10430 Shelbyville Road. We have a social period from 5:30 to 6, and then our meetings start at 6 and usually run to around 7:30. So join us after the break, and we will talk with John Ross Marcus Cox. And one final announcement. There is a debate scheduled in Elizabethtown, Hardin County, on April 11th at 11 a.m. We'll give you the details right after the break. Come back, and we'll have John Ross Marcus Cox talking over some legislation.
Radio, online at kyvoice.org.
Welcome back to Kentucky's Voice. I'm your special host, Dr. Lance Pearson with the Kentucky Liberty Caucus and the Louisville Tea Party. I want to go very quickly through those announcements so that we get this in our clips. You can find those clips on YouTube after the show is over. Usually takes, sometimes it takes up to a day, but we'll have short 10 to 12 minute segments that you can browse online. So let me make those announcements again. Kentucky's Voice, if you listen to 970 AM, you will be able to hear an interview with Daniel Cameron tomorrow. That's Tuesday. Andy Barr, I believe, is going to be on Thursday. And then Nate Morris will be on for an interview next Wednesday. So schedule your time. You can find those, I'm sure, on YouTube after the show, but try to listen to them live on 970 AM. Very similar questions, and you'll get their conservative perspective on some important issues. There is a debate on April 11th. I believe, is that a Saturday? I want to say that's next Saturday or the coming Saturday, April 11th at 11 a.m. That is at ECTC, Elizabethtown Community and Technical College. That's at 600 College Street Road in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. There are a ton of candidates if you are in the Hardin County area. We've got 2 state Senate candidates, I think something like 4, maybe even up to 6 state representatives, 2 sheriff candidates, the PVA, I think there's 3 of those, a bunch of magistrates, a bunch of constables. So if you are in Hardin County and are interested in your local candidates, this is kind of a one-stop shop, so you can find out who's running in the primary. And then the Louisville Tea Party is having their meeting this Thursday, 5:30 social hour, 6 p.m., for a bunch of Louisville candidates. If you're in Jefferson County, a lot of these candidates you'll be able to vote for in the primary and then in the general. So come on out. I think we have 4 or 5 Louisville Metro Council members. I think we've got a state rep or 2, and we may have another candidate. And then we'll also talk through some of the bills that just got passed in our state legislature. Okay, I'm going to bring on my co-host for today. That's John Ross Marcus Cox. If you are interested in contacting him, you can do that through X, what used to be Twitter, at way2, the number 2, much JRMC for John Ross Marcus Cox. Way too much JRMC. So welcome on, John.
Appreciate having me on today again, Dr. Lance. Appreciate you.
Yep. This first segment, we're going to talk a little bit about the just completed pre-veto period portion of the Kentucky State General Assembly. And we're going to talk about some issues, and through most of the rest of the show, we're going to talk about some good bills as well as some bad bills. So the first thing that I want to talk about is actually reading a few paragraphs of an article by a woman named Terry Carter. She writes for the KY Lantern, Kentucky Lantern. If you want to find this article, it is called Shutout, Just Another Day in the Power Frat That Is Kentucky's Legislature. So let me read this. This portion of the article, I actually agree with her. She is a raging liberal. I think she would self-admit to that. I'm on the exact opposite end of the spectrum, but at least the first part of her article I agree with. The last half of the article, I think she went way off the rails. But let me read this portion. On March 26th, I arrived early at the Kentucky Capitol Annex with the expectation that House Bill 78, to protect the $91 billion firearms industry from lawsuits, might be presented in the Kentucky judiciary, even though that committee had, as of 8 a.m., not posted a public agenda for their 9 a.m. meeting. In the end, HB 78 was one of 6 bills on the agenda, but no citizen was there to speak for or against. By the way, I also was at this committee meeting, and I know the sponsor of that, Aaron Reed, very well. I actually think T.J. Roberts may be the sponsor, but Aaron Reed wound up carrying it on the Senate floor. How does one speak on an agenda item that, to their knowledge, does not exist? Since the Kentucky Capitol is closed for years-long renovation, the annex is the only place left in Frankfort in which the public can access legislators and the lawmaking process, particularly since leadership chose to not build even the most minimal public gallery in their temporary chambers. When asked last summer why there was still no public seating in the temporary space, Senate President Robert Stivers cited cost, even though the Finance and Administration Cabinet spokesman Kinsey Woodson told the Lantern in an email that the General Assembly never requested a design option with a public gallery space, and therefore no estimate was ever made. Yeah, do you want to comment on that? How much, when you were down in Frankfort lobbying, was access to legislators when they were coming in and out of the Capitol chambers or when they were circulating? How much of your access to them was based on that?
Well, I mean, the annex is where 99% of your interaction with the legislators takes place.
Yeah.
But it's not just open to the public. I want everyone to know that. As far as you can walk around the Senate's floors and kind of have access to them, but again, they're the ones walking around with more people and they're darting from office to office. To get a meeting, you have to work for that. Yeah. On the House side, you're not getting a meeting with you can't just roam around the hallways. Yeah. So I mean that is an important thing to remember. There was definitely a lot of interaction that took place when they're walking over to chambers and back. Honestly, that's where you get to know them a lot, because you just kind of they're coming out, they're done, so you get to have a little bit of conversation with them once you've got a little bit of a relationship with them at that point. But it certainly is a pivotal factor in just establishing and building relationships with them for sure. Absolutely, yeah.
Yep. And so there's basically a new organization now, and so the public is not allowed to even have access to this special annex extension that they've had, that they now have built out the Senate and House chambers. So you actually cannot even really talk to the legislators as they're walking over there. They just walk down the hall. You're not allowed to follow them in to their area. And then additionally, they have closed off the Senate hallway, so you can't actually roam on the second floor, which is where most of the Senate offices were. So basically, your ability to just offhand interact with legislators is limited to hanging out in the annex building after a committee meeting and just chatting them up as they're walking out of or into a meeting.
So with knowing that now, again, it's been a couple stations I've been down there. If they have blocked off the second floor offices, then this is, Terry Carter's right. This is just a blatant they're just telling you they don't want your input.
Yeah.
I mean, they even when I was down there, and again, I worked my way into where I had nearly free roaming access down there just because I built up some relationships with everyone. But without that ability to just kind of roam around a little bit, you're not going to have any ability to. So I did not realize that. That's a pretty big piece of information to know. But they're basically telling you, hey, we've got our accepted individuals that we're allowing to come back here, and what I mean by that is the lobbyists. And if you're not one of them or on one of their payrolls, then sorry about your luck, is what they're telling you.
Just and we're really just talking about like casual conversation. Like ultimately, you want to schedule a meeting with a lot of these legislators if you want to talk seriously about a bill. But a lot of those relationships are built just like, as we're walking over to the Capitol building, let's have a conversation about this or that. Okay, let me continue with what her commentary was. And so in the 2026 General Assembly, they met this year behind locked doors, far from the public that they allegedly serve. Just last year, Rep. John Blanton championed House Bill 399 to make loudly interfering with legislative proceedings a crime, at least if you did that 3 times, allowing lawmakers direct authority to have a citizen arrested. A year later, you have to wonder how a citizen loudly interferes or even participates meekly in a legislative position in the annex, where the public is welcome but agendas can remain secret, and the House and the Senate, where the public is, in a literal sense, locked out altogether. If you want to actually watch the proceedings, you have to go into the annex in 2 designated rooms, and you watch it just like a person at home would on television. The rest of her article kind of went off the rails. It was implying that Aaron Reed had a conflict of interest in carrying on the Senate floor a piece of legislation about firearms. I actually had a conversation with Aaron Reed about this very topic ahead of it, so maybe she just didn't reach out to him and get comment. He did clear that conflict of interest with the Senate counsel, so he did his due diligence on that. And then she implied that misogyny was a driving force of what gets moved in the Capitol building or not. And, you know, being a man, I don't want to speak on whether there's misogyny or not. I don't personally experience it, so I would rather listen to some commentary by some female legislators. But as we continue with this segment, and we'll continue with this right after the break, we want to talk about some of the issues at the very end of the legislative session right before the veto period starts. And that's where we are now in the calendar during the veto period. All of the legislation that is even remotely controversial has already been passed, or they are waiting to pass it to force the governor to have a veto on a piece of bill to make the governor look bad. So any legislation that they really want to pass, that happened really in the last week right before the start of the veto period. Now, no matter what Andy Beshear does with any of that legislation, the Kentucky Republicans are able to come back in and override that with a simple majority. So as far as the legislative process goes, the governor has very little real authority. The state legislature can override any of his vetoes, unlike at the federal level with a simple majority. At the federal level, you need a 2/3 vote. Okay, after the break, we'll continue talking about some of the issues with the
Now, back to Kentucky's Voice Radio, online at kyvoice.org.
Welcome back to Kentucky's Voice. I'm your special host, Dr. Lance Pearson with the Kentucky Liberty Caucus and the Louisville Tea Party. I'm joined by my special guest, John Ross Marcus Cox. That's a mouthful. You can find him on X at way2 much JRMC. So message him on X, and he's very accommodating, and he usually will DM you back.
Yeah, Lance, I wanted to kind of add one thing to this when we're talking about this bill that Blanton had got through on HB 399. I do think we need to make clear they weren't passing this bill under the premise they're trying to shut down conservative voices. I mean, I think we all can see that the point of it was for years, every time they would try to pass something that the trans community, the LGBTQ community thought was against them, there would be hundreds and hundreds of them down there just disrupting committee meetings and disrupting the chambers, all that. But that's part of legislating, right? You got to think about what the consequences are of whatever it is you're passing. Like, what are going to be the things that you didn't think of are going to happen that are going to happen? In this situation, you're going to have a lot of grassroots conservative, I won't even call them lobbyists because they're not lobbyists. They're just people taking days off from work and trying to go there and meet with their representatives that are going to find it extremely hard to be involved in the legislative process. And you and I know better than anyone how hard it is to get behind the scenes. And this is going to make it even harder. So I just wanted to clear that up, that it wasn't, I don't think it was in like an attempt to shut down conservative voices, but that has been one of the alternative circumstances that came from it.
Yeah. And to be clear, mostly with that legislation, which I did not support, by the way, I didn't like that legislation, but it was mostly to keep people from just shouting down the House or the Senate, and it's mostly an issue with the House. People in the gallery just shouting over whatever's happening and then having to delay, have the police remove people from the gallery, etc. So that is a major nuisance, and it's inappropriate. I just hate to add more laws when a person feels passionately about a bill and they want to try to advocate any way that they can think of, short of violence, obviously. Anyway, let's not get caught up in that. We want to talk about, for this segment, what are some of the issues that when John Cox was down there lobbying consistently and then continuing on, many of these issues are exactly as they were they probably have been issues for the last 30 years, to be honest, when the Democrats were running it. I'm sure the same issues happen. And the first of those issues that I want to bring up is the backloading of the calendar. I think there were somewhere around maybe 1,250 bills, maybe 1,300 bills filed this session. I think only 3 of those bills passed more than a week or a week and a half before the start of the veto period. So they basically have committee meetings. It isn't like they're not doing anything. They're certainly writing legislation, but they're not actually taking final votes on any of that legislation, or very much of that legislation, until the very end. What are some of your thoughts on why they might do that? Why is it that they backload the calendar so much and then try to push 150 bills in the last week of session?
Well, I think the simplest answer is this. There are bills, and some of y'all it's going to be hard for you to believe this, but you can see it at the federal level too. There are some bills they pass out of each chamber, and they never have any intention of ever letting them get through. And so what's the easiest way of making that not as obvious? You run out the clock and you say, we don't have time for it. I mean, we hear it every other session. Well, it's only a 30-day session. Right. We don't have time for it. Oh, then the next year, what's a budget session? We don't have time for it. Well, when you convene for 1 hour on Friday and you go home and you're there for 0 hours on Monday, you're going to run out of time. So I think that's the easiest answer. They do it on purpose so that the bills that leadership wanted through in the first place get through, and then none of the other bills get through. Right. That's the exact answer. Yeah.
So, I think that is a major part of it. I think the other thing is, by backloading the calendar so much, you also retain leverage over rank and file members. If a rank and file member has a bill that they're really passionate about, that they want to get passed, by waiting until the last week, you're not giving that person what they want, so that you can hold that as leverage over them to get a vote on a particular bill that might be a close vote that they want. And so, to me, It's one way that leadership basically maximizes their leverage over rank and file members who might want to go their own way on some controversial vote. Okay, how about another issue that we've talked about before, and that's like the fact that a lot of the legislation that gets passed and a lot of the most controversial legislation isn't written by the legislators themselves. They're written by lobbyists, maybe a special interest group that drafts their legislation. And then even when a legislator has an idea that they really like, all of that legislation has to go through the LRC process where the language, it can be weeks, months even, going back and forth with the LRC in order to get a bill passed. So talk a little bit about that. I know you've had a lot of experience with that.
Yeah, well, this is probably the craziest and most interesting part of it all. As I was down there, I think it was 3 sessions. I was down there pretty much every single day. I'm on dime down there. I mean, you and I were working behind the scenes, but we assume these. Actually, I don't know what we assume, how we assume the bills get drafted. What I can tell you is how they get drafted is lobbyists write them and they bring them to legislators and they file them, and then the LRC will say, well, this won't pass, and they'll change it, and then they'll water it down and they'll make it to where it doesn't really do much of anything. And so what Dr. Lance and I here learned over our course of time was that, you know what, we're just going to write our own, because it's actually not, first of all, it's not that hard. Second of all, that's the only way it's going to get filed, because the legislators don't have time during session to write their own legislation. So if we don't do it, nobody was going to do it. So whether it goes back to our masking bill, HB 51 back in 2022, I believe it was, or our alternative version of school choice, which is still a sore topic for me, because I still think it was the only school choice bill that had a chance of getting passed in the state, or whatever it may be. Or you go and look at other bills that other conservative groups have gotten filed, and they bring in what are called it's called model legislation. That might be the biggest trigger word out of all of it. Out of all the words in there, the terms they use for me is model legislation, because it doesn't take into account anything specific to your state and things that you can get passed here. It also doesn't take into account things that are going to be easily challenged here from that other states don't have in their state constitution. So it's a lazy way of writing legislation, but it's an absolute problem. And us as individuals don't understand how big of a problem it is, because we have issues that we want passed, but that you can't pass an issue. You have to pass a bill.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. And I don't want to actually. There are a lot of very good lobbyists down there that are in it for the right reasons. Some organizations that we've talked about before, Family Foundation, Commonwealth Policy Center. There are some people up there that I think are genuinely up there advocating as lobbyists, or if you want to call them a special interest group. They're up there trying to do the right thing and pass legislation that helps the everyday person. A lot of the lobbyists, however, are just pushing for regulations of a particular industry. For example, they want a government handout, or they want some regulation that keeps their competitors from having a say on legislation. All right. And now let's get into some different categories of what I consider the biggest issue up there, and that's transparency. Ultimately, legislation gets drafted behind closed doors. A lot of the decision making that happens, it can happen, for example, in something called a free conference committee that the public has no access to. Legislation can be brought in front of a committee, what they call a committee sub, which is kind of an amendment or a replacement of the bill with different language, can be presented the morning of or the night of a committee meeting. The agenda for the committee meeting might not be made public until 30 minutes before legislation. I think Terry Carter actually complained about that. So there are all kinds of mechanisms, and we'll talk about these mechanisms right after the break. These mechanisms that basically prevents the public from being able to know what's happening at what given time, what bill is going to be heard when, what committee meeting do they need to show up to. They basically have to have a behind-the-scenes relationship with the legislator altogether if they want to even participate and know which committee meeting, which committee the bill that they're interested in is going to come up for. And so there are many different ways that the process is basically keeps the public at best arm's length, to to some extent, keep them totally out of the process. After the break, we'll talk about transparency issues among legislators themselves. Join us after the break. This is Kentucky's Voice.
Back to Kentucky's Voice Radio, online at kyvoice.org.
Welcome back to Kentucky's Voice. I'm your special host, Dr. Lance Pearson with the Kentucky Liberty Caucus and the Louisville Tea Party. I'm joined with my special guest, John Ross Marcus Cox. You can find him on X, which used to be Twitter. You can find him at way, the number 2, much, MUCH, and then JRMC. So find him online. He's very active on there, and DM him, and he'll probably DM him back if you have some commentary about some legislation or some issues with the legislature. Okay, we got into this at the very end of the last segment. I want to continue that conversation, and so a lot of the complaint that the public has that are invested in some state legislation, maybe they've got a bill that they're really interested in. They feel like that they're not able to participate in the process because they don't know what is happening when. They don't actually know what version of the bill is going to be brought up for discussion. There are things called committee substitutes that you can replace the entire text of a bill with something almost completely different. They slap a title amendment, and a bill that started off doing one thing turns out it's doing something totally different. And so the thing I want to really focus in here is this is actually something that harms, I think, the rank and file legislators. A lot of times, and this is shocking to people who aren't familiar with the process, a lot of the time legislators don't have the opportunity really to read the legislation that they're supposed to be voting on, either at the committee level or on the House floor, and especially and almost always coming out of a free conference committee at the very end of at the very end of the period right before the veto session. They will have closed door meetings with 5 or 6 legislators, and they will just come out and give a 1-sentence summary of what the bill, the final version of the bill is. And now you got to vote yes or no based on someone's word of a one sentence summary of maybe 10 pages worth of changes to the bill text. So, John, why don't you just talk a little bit about the way that even for legislators, sometimes they have no choice but to vote on legislation. They're put in a position where they have to vote on legislation when they haven't really had the opportunity to even read it. So what are some of those techniques that are used? Committee substitutes, not allowing people to file floor amendments, stripping off floor amendments by committee substitute, all of those details.
Yeah, so, you just checked them all off. The committee subs, like you said, basically you can take one bill and at the drop of a dime, you can turn it into whatever bill you want to turn it into, like not even overnight. We're talking sometimes within hours of a committee meeting or minutes before a committee meeting. The floor amendments issue, one of the things we talked about is the way they pit reps and senators against each other with floor amendments, and leadership will actually they'll fuel the flames of making you think that it's a slight against you if someone has filed an amendment on your bill. I mean, that's a huge issue. And then just like not giving, by using the running out the clock method and saying, well, we have no time to give this out to you. You basically are forced to decide, is this no vote worth risking my reelection when I don't even really know what the bill says, and it may very well help my district, and I'm definitely not going to get, I'm not going to lose any points by voting for it, right?
Yeah.
We see that. I mean, you see that all the time. So, I mean, all these, and this, again, it comes back to where the lobbyists and everything all plays into a factor. And I just, over the break, we were talking, say what you want about the process. Here's the truth about it. The process isn't changing anytime soon. Right, that can be a long-term goal to change that. But as far as in the short term, we've got a short window of getting through grassroots conservative legislation now, and the only way I see that happening is doing what you and I did for 3 years together, and that's just having a grassroots lobbyist down there that their number one priority is getting bills passed and doing it without worrying about any notoriety, any fanfare, any of that. I mean, this is the one thing I've always talked about is, when I was going down there, I wasn't fundraising. I didn't care who got credit. I didn't care if my name was on a pamphlet at the end of the session. I just wanted good bills to get through and bad bills not to get through, and for us to have helped that process. And you're not going to be able to do it without, and I don't know how you do that. I don't know if it's grassroots, crowdfunding, or what have you, but these lobbyists, all these things we're talking about, they're the ones that really do, in combination with leadership, they weave all this together. Mm-hmm. So, again, these legislators are going from meeting to meeting, committee hearing to committee hearing. They don't have time to do it all. So they'll have a lobbyist. They walk out of one committee meeting, hey, we figured out a way to put this bill on this bill, marry them together. If you'll send it over to LRC, they do it. It's that simple. And it sounds like there's no way that happened, but they typed it up on Microsoft Word. They handed it to them in the hallway, said take it down the hall to LRC and tell them to do it word for word. And that's literally how it happens. And we like to think it's some big we have this idealistic view as citizens that this looks like something from the Revolutionary period. Yeah. And maybe it does look like that. Maybe that's what it looked like then too. But it's actually, it just requires having someone on the ground that has the relationships that can go to one bill sponsor from the person who's wanting to file the amendment and say, hey, they don't mean this the wrong way. You trust me. You haven't got to talk to them about it, but we've got a good relationship. Don't take it as a slight. I mean, it's what it's going to take. And I don't know if that's even possible. It's what I tried to do for 3 years, and I just couldn't figure out a way to make it work financially, but that's what it's going to take, is to get a grassroots lobbyist that's not worried about doing scorecards or pamphlets, or that doesn't have skin in the game to where if bills don't pass, they have a hard time fundraising, right? It's got to be, I'm down here just for solely like the principles and values, the conservative grassroots values that we have, and just let the chips fall. That's what it's going to require. Yeah. Yep.
Okay, we've talked a lot about some of the structural issues that I think happen and really get exposed in the last week before the veto period. One thing I want to reemphasize that John mentioned was, you hear this excuse all the time from the legislators, and that's whenever we're in a budget year and they've got 60 days to pass legislation, it's, the focus is really on the budget. We can't get the priority bills that you want passed because we just don't have time. This is a budget year. And then when we're not in the budget year, every 2 years we have a budget year, the off year, it's, we only have 30 days. So there's always an excuse for why good legislation can't pass. Nevertheless, now, so there was a lot of negativity or like structural problems that we were discussing. Overall, I would say that this session actually was better than I expected. There are some good bills that passed. There are some very important bills that passed. And so we do want to put some spotlight on that. So let me just talk through a couple of these bills, and John, weigh in on any of these things. To me, other than the budget bills, ultimately the executive branch budget came in around $31.5 billion over 2 years. So, a little under $16 billion a year on average over these next 2 years are going to be spent just on the executive branch budget. And that's just the state portion of that. That's not counting federal money that comes into these agencies. So a lot of money on the line. We'll talk a little bit about the budget, but that's probably for another show. The most important other bill, I think, was HB 1. And this was opting Kentucky into the federal tax credits for school choice, basically educational expenses for kids. You can get up to a $1,700 per person. So if it's a spouse, That's up to $3,400 worth of tax credits from the federal government to pay for some educational expenses. Although those donations that you make that can be reimbursed dollar for dollar, those have to go through a scholarship granting organization. That's HB1. Did you have any thoughts on this? I know you're passionate about school choice, and so this is, I think, almost, given the Kentucky Supreme Court, this is almost the best that we could get.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I do think this is one of the points where, with President Trump, we do need to give him a lot of credit for actually following through on this, on HB1 and what HB1 was at a federal level, and also shout out to T.J. Roberts and all those that carried it. I mean, it's definitely a big piece of legislation here. I am skeptical of the fact that this is going to flow through other organizations. Anytime you see that happening, it's like, what percentage of the funds are actually going to make it down to the individual level? But that'll be left to be seen in the future. Yep. But overall, I think it's a step in the right direction. I do think at a state level, it still should be something we are trying to push. Yeah. And I think if it ever is revived here in the state, the bill that you and I wrote that was in direct competition with Suzanne Miles's, I forget what the bill number was now. Yeah. That was Josh Callaway's bill, should be the one that is looked at, because I think exactly what these boxes are trying to check, we were doing that. Yeah. And so, but I do think it's a step in the right direction. Yes.
Yep, I do too. The another bill that passed that I think is very good is SB 59. This is a ban on taxpayer-funded advocacy for ballot questions, and it gives penalties. So this was already actually kind of part of law, that you weren't supposed to be using, for example, public school funds in order to advocate for or against a ballot measure like the school choice question that we had. Mm-hmm. A lot of schools were posting on their social media pages, vote no on ballot question or constitutional amendment number 2. And that was illegal. The problem was there was actually no penalty. So did you have any thoughts on that? That's HB 59.
Well, I mean, the biggest word in this, and I'm glad you're hitting on this, because this is also one of the issues with a large percentage of legislation that gets through, is if there's no penalty, then it's really not even a law. And so you see this across the board where you'll get a good bill through, and by the time it does get to the second chamber, or it gets through reconciliation, whatever you want to call it, for the free conference committee, the penalties are gone. And so then it just doesn't really have any teeth after that. So I think that's the biggest word to focus on there.
Yep. I think it was a good session for the Second Amendment also. So there were 2 bills. HB 312 is a bill that reduced the minimum age from 21 down to 18 for concealed carry. Now, you actually do have to get a permit. You have to go through the process. It's a provisional permit in order to be able to conceal carry if you are 18 up to 21. Everyone over 21, we have constitutional carry, where you don't need a license in order to conceal carry as long as you're not a felon, etc. So that, and then we also had HB 78, which is basically a prohibition on suing gun manufacturers or gun stores as long as they did their due diligence. They made They manufactured the firearm appropriately. They followed all the federal check marks when they were deciding who to sell a gun to. It gives them immunity as long as they did all of the due diligence that they were supposed to. That's HB 78. So do you have any comment about that? I know a lot of our listeners are passionate for the Constitution and especially the Second Amendment.
No, I mean, I just think the biggest thing is, if you can go fight for your country at 18, you should be able to own a weapon at 18. I mean, I think it's pretty, and then just the shall not be infringed part. I mean, I think this is, from a conservative grassroots standpoint, this is about as basic as you can get. And if we're not willing to stand up for that principle, then are we going to stand up for any of the other ones?
Yep. We've only got a few seconds left. Let me talk about the one constitutional amendment you're likely to have on your ballot this fall. This is a ban on the governor being able to pardon people 60 days before at the end of his term, and then all the way through the start of the next term. No more pardon power during that period. We'll talk about it after the break, as well as some other legislation.
back to Kentucky's Voice Radio, online at kyvoice.org.
Welcome back to Kentucky's Voice. I'm your special host, Dr. Lance Pearson with the Kentucky Liberty Caucus and the Louisville Tea Party. I'm joined by my guest, John Ross Marcus Cox. That's at Way Too Much JRMC on X. The 2 is a number. We have been talking about some good bills. I want to just very quickly hit on several of those good bills, and then we'll get into what people are really entertained by. That's some bad bills that probably shouldn't have passed. So a good bill that passed is SB 137. This gives a provisional license to people that are medical professionals, like a person that got their medical degree in certain countries that have a high human development index, basically first world or high, third world countries where they actually get good medical training. If they are going to serve in an underrepresented area, like in rural Kentucky, they can get a provisional license so that they can perform a doctor as long as they go through and get that provisional license from the state. There were some bills that protected children, SB 17 and HB 4. Those are basically refining some of the social media age verification requirements, and then HB 4 was basically making it a crime to groom an adult to groom a minor. So those are some good bills. HB 250 mandates phonics instead of these crazy 3Qing learning processes of learning reading. So just basically getting some of the nonsense out of our public schools. Let's go, however, on to some bad bills. And so we've talked about this bill a couple of times on this show, but I want to emphasize, and I know that John Ross, Marcus Cox, is pretty passionate about it as well, SB 199, which basically grants immunity for pesticide or herbicide manufacturers. And so SB 199, what are your thoughts on this bill, John? I'm passionately against it, and I think you are too.
Well, I think my biggest issue is that it's from a Maha movement standpoint, whether it be a national level, state level. If you want to know one of the biggest ways we were able to expand the tent and to get a lot of these women that typically would have been Democratic voters to vote Republican. One of the primary reasons was because the Make America Healthy Again movement. I'm gonna give my wife a shout out here. This is something she is very. And 5 years ago, we were those same people that were just drinking all the Kool-Aid, believing everything from the FDA, and COVID has kind of turned it all upside down for us, including the food pyramid and all of it. We're looking at all of it different here. But this was one of those bills where it seemed just pretty cut and dry that this would, if we're not going to vote against this bill, then are we really serious? Right. And so it's also one of those bills where we had some grassroots, we definitely had the momentum there, but we had, what's what I'm looking for here?
Opposition.
We had opposition, but we had some very good proponents that had clout in the legislative branch. And I know on good authority that several people that were on the fence on how to vote for this bill was deferring and at least listening to the floor speeches of those people that they assumed would be against it and ended up voting for it. So, and the bill barely passed anyways. And you brought the point that maybe some of the people that didn't vote at all would have voted for it. But here's the deal. If we're not going to vote against the ones that are obvious, regardless of whether or not we're afraid it's going to get us unelected. I mean, again, that's the whole point. We're trying to elect people that aren't going down there to try to be career politicians, and they're going to vote on principle and on values and on what their voters wanted. This is one of those things. So whether it be state level, federal level, we've made it pretty clear from a grassroots standpoint. We're tired of giving these big corporate conglomerates that do not care about us as individuals a pass on these things. I mean, I was given the example. It takes me back to the opioid epidemic. If you've watched any of the documentaries on Hulu or Netflix or anything, I mean, my own father, my biological father, died of a drug overdose, and that was perpetuated by companies that were given these vast immunities to, and again, we're giving them because of the FDA label. Oh, the opioids, they're not addictive.
Right.
Well, now we know they were lying, but it took years, decades to prove that they were lying because they were just hiding their emails or printing off millions of documents and then making someone have to fund that and get an attorney to go through all the tens of millions of pages of emails. So to me, it's just, I don't know, it's indicative of whether or not we're serious.
Yeah.
If we're serious about our movement. And to me, it's just sad that it ended up passing through, regardless of what a few number of individuals were saying that it was going to kill an industry or whatever. Call their bluff. I don't believe it. I just don't believe it. How did we feed people for centuries without glyphosate?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So again, to me, it's indicative of whether or not the movement's serious. And I do want to challenge our legislators going forward that when these bills come up, even if it's going to cost you your seat, that's one of the reasons we're voting you in, because we believe you have the backbone and you're willing to take on that risk.
Okay.
So,
yep. Okay, this is another hot button bill that got a lot of publicity over this past week. This is HB 757. Now, HB 757, this is an example of the way the process works at the very end of the session, right before the veto period. HB 757 is actually something that kind of alters the tax code. And so it's a 400-page bill. And on the last day that they could possibly do it, they slipped a provision in that basically guarantees that as long as it's privately funded, they will put a statue to Mitch McConnell in the state rotunda. So like kind of once the Capitol reopens, which probably won't happen for about 4 or 5 years, that might even be optimistic. But when that happens, somebody, and probably Mitch McConnell himself or the donors to him, will have a statue commissioned of Mitch McConnell. And as long as this is still the law, that statue will wind up being in the rotunda. So I know that this was controversial online. What are some of your thoughts on this? And by the way, this is an illustration. It's a 400-page bill that relates to alterations of the tax code. Some of that bill is fantastic. They reinstituted the exception for religious organizations on sales and use tax. And you've heard me advocate for this a long time. If I'm a Catholic church that's having a fish fry for Lent, the current law was they were supposed to be paying sales tax to the state. They were supposed to be calculating and collecting all that, even though none of the churches did it. And it basically forced all these different religious organizations to be tax cheats. So there were some good things in that 757. There were also some bad things. So just maybe even focused on just the McConnell issue. What were your thoughts on 757?
Well, kind of tongue in cheek here. One thing about what Terry Carter's article is talking about is I wonder once this renovation is done, just how much access the general public is going to have to the Capitol building. People are going to forget what it used to be like. This will for sure, the rotunda will be one of the places they'll allow us in there since they want us to know that they let McConnell get a statue in there. Yeah. I did go back into Real Clear Politics, and I went back as far as I could go. The highest approval rating I could find for Mitch McConnell was 32%. His average approval rating right now is 20.2%. Yeah. So it's funny to me that they're going to, again, I guess we're just giving out statues to people that can hold on to power the longest. I guess that's how we're gonna. But like I think you made the comment for this. There is actually a building right down the street that makes a ton of sense for him to have a statue in. I don't know why we're not just doing it there, but you can opine at this point.
Well, the funded by donations from the people that collect money for Mitch McConnell, the people that hit people up for the Senate Majority Fund. The Republican headquarters is right down the street from the Capitol building, and it's called the McConnell, Kentucky Republican headquarters. So it makes a lot of sense to put that statue in the McConnell Republican headquarters. And by the way, I want to emphasize, I actually have only limited problems with McConnell. I think on net, he did some very important things, especially as it related to the Supreme Court, but also bringing back a lot of money for various important projects in Kentucky. So I don't have a lot of deep animosity. I just think there are other people that belong ahead of him. And McConnell would be the first person to ever have a statue in the rotunda while he was still living, assuming that he makes it 4 or 5 more years. And I certainly hope he does. Most notably, Zachary Taylor, President of the United States, who spent over 20 years and most of his childhood living in Louisville, doesn't have a statue in the rotunda. Anyway, now that overshadowed the fact that there was a lot of bad stuff. There were some good things in 757. Any 400-page bill is going to have a lot of good stuff and a lot of bad stuff. Most notably, 757 allocates, let's see, I think there's a tax credit of up to $40 million to anyone that spends over $150 million to rehabilitate a historic structure containing a minimum of 25 stories. This is a $40 million handout for whoever is going to remodel the Humana headquarters in downtown Louisville, is what that really is. There's also a waiver of sales tax on a 3-day sporting event that attracts more than 100,000 attendees. This is a handout to Red Mile, who is hoping to host the harness racing equivalent of the Breeders' Cup. It's called the Breeders' Crown. So anyway, various handouts, corporate handouts, and you can make a justification for both of those. I don't want the Humana building basically sitting there idle for the next decade. But nevertheless, that's $40 million in state tax money that we're handing out to what will be a private $150 million, a company that can spend $150 renovating a building. Okay, another example of a piece of legislation and this actually was a theme this time. I think this goes for House Bill 500 as well as HB 2. The version that came out of the House, I thought, was cutting things down to the bone, which is where it should be as far as government spending on various things. And so, in particular with HB 2, which is the Medicare bill, but Medicaid especially, it basically stripped the ability to have government-funded health insurance for able-bodied adults if they are not actively seeking work. And so as that progressed from the House, where it was a bare bones bill, various pork spending is what I would call it, got added in the Senate. Very much the same thing happened with HB 500. It came out of the House and it was very bare bones. The Senate added in a bunch of pork and it got up to $31.5 billion. Now, that's drastically better than I'm sure it would have been if the Democrats were in charge. But we got that theme from this budget session that the House was really interested in cutting down and having a very lean government spending package, and the Senate decided that they wanted to saw off the hard edges of it, if you want to say that, and spend a lot of taxpayer money on it. All right, thanks for joining us on Kentucky's Voice. Reminder, April 11th, the debate, and Louisville Tea Party on Thursday.